In our formal gardens, we've decided to switch 2 of our raised beds over to rose gardens. We visited with you last fall about growing roses, and we got so enthused about it we decided we needed some more out in our studio garden. So I've got some compost here that will be part of our planting process, and I just want to give you some tips on success with roses. And most of the roses that people buy in Oklahoma are bare root. And by this we mean that they've come usually already grafted onto a rose rootstock, so they'll get good growth back at the nursery. But they come with a fairly strong, fleshy root system that upon arrival, a lot of people think you just stick it in the ground and forget it. But what you need to realize is that root system does not have the little fibrous hair roots to absorb water and nutrients. And so you need to take care in planting and aftercare to make sure you have good success. And as I mentioned, roses are grafted for the most part. Sometimes they're grown on their own roots, but you can see the knobby area right here where we had the rootstock, and here's where the scion was placed on there. Another tip I want to give you is that with roses, we cover that up and bury it under the soil, which is just the opposite of what we tell you with fruit trees. With fruit trees, you want that graft about 2 inches above the soil line because you need the rootstock to influence the tree. But with roses, it was just put on there to encourage the rose to be fairly precocious. Now the planting hole for roses needs to be about 18 inches wide and about 12 inches deep or deeper to accommodate that big root system that it comes with. And I've taken this rose and soaked it overnight to help it absorb as much moisture as possible. And then in our planting hole here, we've trenched the sides and kind of built up the center so that we have a nice framework for this rose to sit on. Sort of a volcano shape. And the key is to make sure that it's seated very well on that soil and then to start backfilling. Now I want you to notice that the soil we have here has quite a bit of sand in it. One thing that rose growers tell us is you don't want to use peat moss as your additive in the soil to loosen the soil up. I also want you to notice how well drained this site is. We're up in a raised bed. You want those roots to have good drainage, and if you have a site in your yard that stays moist all summer, that's not a good site for roses. Obviously they need about 8 hours of full sun a day, so make sure you site them in a sunny place so they'll bloom well. There are a few old rose varieties that do real well in semi-shade, but most of them need full sun. And as you backfill that, make sure that you add water as you go, just like with any tree or shrub planting process. You want to do this gradually, not just stick it in the ground. Let that water soak in. And again, we want to emphasize that that graft needs to be about 2 to 3 inches below the soil line. So we're going to cover that up completely. Now, this is soil that we've worked with for a number of years, and it has aged manure in it and sand, as I mentioned. And the rose that we're planting is a climbing rose. It's a variety that's black spot resistant, so we won't have to spray very much. I want you to notice now that we've got that graft completely covered. And I'm going to continue to mound soil around this because this is a dormant plant that was shipped dormant, and we're wanting it to start breaking dormancy in early April. But those first few weeks we want to keep the canes pretty well covered, and the reason for that is that this whole surface area is an area for water to transpire out of. Yet we don't have an active root system yet. It's a dormant root system that's just coming to life. And so the final step is to take some compost and pile that around the plant as well. Now as soon as these buds that are sticking out start to show life, and that'll be in about 10 days, then you can pull this compost away. But this is going to let the plant gradually acclimate to the area and prevent it from drying out too much. And believe me, I've killed several rose bushes before in the past by not taking good care when they're first planted and mounding compost around them, and also double checking that they have plenty of moisture. You want to water them fairly frequently, about every 3 days. Make sure they have good moisture. If you remember last fall on our rose show, a number of our rose growers have a drip irrigation system, which is also a good idea, but the first few weeks they need plenty of supplemental watering to get them off to a good start. Well, that's about it on roses. As I mentioned, this is a climber. I've got one more to plant, and then let me show you how we're going to dress out this bed to add a lot of interest to it this summer. For many rose growers, a perfect complement is to have a clematis vine weaving its way among the climbing part of the rose. And sometimes it's blooming at the same time. Other times you may have a climbing rose that stops blooming in midsummer and the clematis can carry on for you at that time. It just depends on the kind that you plant. But take a look at this. This is a nice healthy one that came in recently. We've, just like the roses, we've had it soaking, but notice how it looks or resembles a strawberry plant or an asparagus plant, and the method is pretty much the same. You want to spread those roots out as much as possible, and to quote Professor Paul Mitchell, you want its feet in the shade and its head in the sun. And so we're going to put this on a nice mound of soil. The variety we're planting is Henri, and it's a large white flowering clematis, and it'll look nice with our pink climbing rose. And you just want to work the soil in around it. And then we're going to top that off with some compost to keep the soil nice and moist after we water it in. With all fleshy rooted plants like this, that pre-soaking before planting really benefits it, especially if you happen to have mail ordered one or if you've bought ones that have just been held in compost for a few days. It really helps to soak them in. And then we'll just cover that over. You don't want to totally cover the buds because they're coming out of dormancy right now and they'll begin to grow. We've planted this right next to our T-post so we can train it right up onto the trellis. And I think that's going to look real nice with the rose. And we'll keep an eye on this through the summer. Make sure that soil stays cool so it can thrive, because their roots will not take a hot soil. Well, as a complement to our rose bed, we thought about it and decided that we needed some kind of a living ground cover that was going to be heat tolerant and smell good at the same time. And since other parts of our formal garden are in a fragrance garden and also planted into an herb garden, we decided to continue that theme. So we have some 3-inch pots of thyme here that we're going to plant in among our roses. We think it's going to be a very complementary feature. Now, one nice thing about potted plants is that their tags come beside them and they're not wrapped around them. And one final point I want to make as we get these thyme plants in is that with roses, usually the tag comes wrapped around the stem of the plant. You want to make sure you remove that. When we were planting that rose, we didn't take that one off, but we need to. And one tip is, if you don't have a marker right away, if you're doing climbing roses, you might want to take a look over here. We just wrapped ours around the bottom of our ranch panel. And so that will tell us which rose we have planted back here, and it'll keep it from getting girdled. Well, I'm going to finish up planting these. Hopefully, if you're planting roses, you'll think about the overall scheme and think about some attractive ground covers that will complement the foliage and the flowers of your rose garden.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. You can also find more recent videos on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.